it's easier to have a good living standard and save. But like the United States, when per capita income was 40 times that in China, it started to borrow from China because they have a big saving mentality. When you have a poor person who doesn't have much, they want to save. Their saving is in our currency because when they think, how do I save in world currency? I'm going to buy dollar-denominated debt and I'm going to save in it when we borrow. And that's been the case. We didn't experience what our prior generations experienced. I know my dad went through World War II. He went through depression and war. His mentality is very different in terms of, what you take for granted or how you save. And that creates a cycle. One man's debts are somebody else's assets. The world right now is holding a lot of money in debt instruments. It could be money market funds. It could be bond funds. And we were in an environment in which bonds went up for 40 years and everybody's comfortable. And there wasn't an inflation pressure. And so everybody thinks that cash is the safest place to be because they don't think about its buying power. And so what happens is you have to satisfy both the debtors and the creditors, which is difficult to do when you've got more. Okay, you got a lot of debt. Because if you pay that debt back in real money, in hard money, so the guy gets paid back the buying power that he lent, that is going to be really bad because you won't have enough money. So the easiest tax is to tax through the printing of money. And that's because nobody asked where did the money come from. The checks came in and we're all happy. And we didn't take the money away from anybody, but you lose the buying power. And so what happens is when you make that choice that you don't want to own it, you sell it. And so the amount of selling is not just the deficit. The government will have a deficit of 5 or 6% of GDP. It'll have to borrow. So that means it sells bonds or sells debt of 5 or 6% of GDP. But if others sell too, because they say, I'm not getting a real return, I'm not going to hold that, then you have a lot of selling. That means that either interest rates go up a lot and shut the thing down, or the government prints more money. And that's the mechanics. History's shown us, chapter 3, I think it is, called The Value of Money. And 100% of the time when they're in that position, they'll print the money. Here's the big thing that people think. Money and financial assets are not wealth. They're claims on wealth, but they're worthless. It has no value. It's not real. It's just like digital. It only has wealth, real wealth, if you sell it and you go buy something. It works as long as people who are holding those financial assets want to keep holding those financial assets, even though they're losing buying power to them. It's a Ponzi scheme. That's why if you look at history, even in the Old Testament, there was this idea of the year of Jubilee. What it meant is, okay, you always have these financial obligations rising relative to the other. It happened so often that they said, okay, let's just plan on it. Like every 50 years, we're going to have to wipe it clean. Old Testament in the Bible. Okay. And they said every year we're going to have to do it. And then it was a system actually where they would say, now that you know it's going to be wiped out in 50 years, you will operate as though it will wipe out in 50 years. And therefore you won't have the Ponzi scheme as much. But that is how the Ponzi scheme has always worked, right? So that's what it is. Now you have a choice. You can hold those things, but then as they start having bad returns and you're holding them, what are you going to do? How are you going to deal with that? I want to be first out, but that's why you can be writer. You can be writer if you go through the jungle like I'm describing with people that see things that you can't see and you're open-minded, you can be writer. That's why I say that the key to success is much more in knowing how to deal with what you don't know than anything you know. There are two things. First was interconnected and therefore safer. That was the theory prior to World War II because they would marry each other. Royalty would be married and everybody's in the same family. There's no evidence either in the actions that are being taken or in history. Even members of the same family can kill each other. They can be so entwined in the same family that they give them plenty to fight about. The second one in that dynamic is it depends on both countries. Do you have a win-win relationship or do you have a lose-lose relationship? The problems with China have a history. There was one thing under Obama, then there was a tilt and it changed to Trump. And they're now at the point where it's almost irreconcilable differences and each side is worried that the other side could kill it. In the book, I described the prisoner's dilemma. The prisoner's dilemma is Let's imagine that there are two people and the best thing you could do is cooperate, but you don't know whether the other is going to cooperate or kill you. What should you do? You should kill the other one, because otherwise there's some risk that they kill you and survival matters, and it's tough to get to cooperation. And so we're kind of in that situation now. China is essentially in the enviable position of finding out how a war goes. And so because the NATO countries and Russia and Ukraine are in its type of war, you can see how that goes. You can see, for example, that the U.S. brings out its big weapon is sanctions. By the way, sanctions have always in history been the big weapon that's brought out before the big military weapon. Like in World War II, Japan was expanding in Asia, and the United States imposed sanctions. They sort of embargoed the oil, made it more difficult for them to get oil, and they froze their assets. And so they were stuck, and then they reacted and they bombed Pearl Harbor. I've been going to China since 1984, not for money, but for interest, because if I can find interesting places with interesting people and see it through their eyes, I can do that. And I was able to help them learn about the financial markets and so on. And that's led me to know the leaders there, as well as lots of poor people, and to see it through their eyes. And I would say they do not want a war. So we have something that's very similar to that. Now, when I look at the situation there, I think there are three big questions that we don't yet have the answers to. The first question is who wins in the UK-NATO war, essentially. Does Putin win or does the West win? And here's what winning looks like for Putin. That he controls the eastern part of the Ukraine without being regularly threatened. That the economy in Russia has something like a 12% downturn, but is tolerable. Now, since Russia imports everything, you could actually totally shut them off. But how much will those sanctions crush Russia, or will it be tolerable? They are so used to suffering that they're almost uncomfortable if they're not suffering. If you go back 1917, they have the revolution, they lose World War II, they lose 30 million people. Then Stalin comes in and they lose another 30 million people. You know, it's that kind of thing. They have communism. Then they have a bankruptcy and the whole thing collapses in 89. So they won't trade off that issue generally for a 12% fall in GDP. I would say the odds of that are very, very, very small because of a variety of things in terms of security and other things. We'll see. But if he loses, and he appears to be losing, I think he'll escalate. And so if he loses, I think that you will see escalation, and that'll take the form of probably threatening nuclear. And also it's a very dangerous thing. And we'll see what the power of sanctions are. And then the third thing we'll see is how the sides line up. West and East. You could look at the countries right now and you could look at their actions and you could see which side they're lining up. Do they abide by the sanctions? Do they not abide by the sanctions? So the beginning of the picture of which are the allied countries and which are the access countries, like in World War II, there's a European war and there's an Asian war and different countries line up, but by and large, they're consistent. And so we're beginning to see those things. Only in Europe. It's so interesting. And I could rattle the countries off. India, Brazil, Mexico, Indonesia, China, almost half the world has taken either the other side or has said, I'm not going to participate. Don't make the mistake of just looking at the European NATO countries. So anyway, China can watch that and how that works and learn a lot. The world has now changed to a whole different dynamic in which ideologies rule. Fight and rule. For example, think about it this way. The person who makes decisions for Twitter will have a bigger effect on our lives and choices than the Supreme Court's decisions. In other words, I could do it this way or I could do it that way. The system we used to be in was a fairly open system in which economic would rule. If you made more money, you got more resources, and resources were allocated by that. That's much less the case now. Now ideologies are taking control. So, for example, DeSantis, governor of Florida, and Disney. The ideology that you have, and that I will fight for it, and I will use all the resources I have, is the determiner. And in some extent, it almost needs to, like in some respects, what's going to get money to the kids in schools that we're talking about. But that notion that if the causes that people are behind are more important to them than the system is in jeopardy. because that system of how do we work these things out together becomes a power thing. I don't think you're going to see either side giving up, losing. We played by the game, playing cricket or something, and then we go off the field. That was amazing that we did that for so long. But I don't think that you're going to do that as much because it's a win at all cost game. And I think that you're going to have this pervasively within the United States. So you get more nationalism. You're going to have more nationalism. Why? Because I need self-sufficiency and that other country might be an enemy. And then you go within a country and you see the same thing within a country. I need to fight for what I believe. So we are now in a fight for what you believe type of environment that will determine things. And we're just not used to it, but that's what's happening. So can we be good with each other? If we could just be good with each other and not fight and be afraid of fighting, have the middle work together and so on. Let the extremists who are fighting calm down. Like if I was president, I would have a bipartisan cabinet because politics now, it's like one side beats the other. On the statistics, roughly speaking, 30% of the population is extreme right by measures such as, there's a range of things. What percentage of the Republicans or Democrats think that members of the other party should die? It's 15 and 10. What percentage would not want their child to marry the member of the other party? What percentage of those think the election was stolen? If you start to use those numbers, roughly 30% is, by my measure, probably pretty extreme right. And because of that, that's the majority of the Republican Party has to have unified. Maybe it's 25, maybe it's 30. I don't know. But we know how the Republican Party largely is being influenced by Trump. The parties are fighting within each other and the moderates are dropping out. Not so much they can't finance, it's because of the way politics is. It's brutal and it's lies. Yeah. You can only win if you are one of those extremes that win the primary because they're in that war. So now you hear that I agree that the majority is in the middle, but there is a dynamic here. That's why, like if I was president, I'd want a bipartisan cabinet, or I want whatever it is that's going to bring, compromise the middle, us together. That's why I think the president, they should have the equivalent of the Manhattan Project with moderates from both parties, work together to re-engineer this and agree on it. And everybody's so hung up, it's got to be exactly the way they want, that you get nothing. Look, I don't care what they agree to. If you have smart people from both sides and they come up with a program, I'm almost certain it's going to be much better than what we've got. I think there's a systemic problem, by the way, in terms of the way capitalism works that needs to be adjusted because the profit system and the reward system doesn't accomplish all the goals that we need to have accomplished. In other words, do we have broad-based prosperity and opportunity? So there are certain adjustments that could be made to that to make it work better. The right, the capitalists, know better how to increase the size of the pie, but they don't know how to divide the pie. And the left knows how to divide the pie, but they don't know how to increase the size of the pie by being more productive. They both can happen simultaneously.
Hey, there we go.
Like an investment in good education. I'm just giving one good example. Invest in good education. Have an acceptable bottom so that the kids don't become those adults. I'm in Connecticut, $600 million a year is spent on incarceration because the kids grow up in these households and the kids have a problem walking to school because they have to pass through neighborhoods where there are gangs and shootings. Why can't you have the police assure safe passage? Well, they can only afford 275 police because it either has to come out of that or the food or whatever it is. But I had two parents who cared for me, loved me. I went to a public school and I came out and there was equal opportunity. That's all you need, or at least one parent. And then if you got one parent, it's very difficult. And if you don't provide that, then you're going to have children who are going to be so disadvantaged that rather than assets, they'll become liabilities. And it's so unfair. So you can go back and you could see, I can go back and study all these empires. And it's a basic thing because you don't know where the talented person's going to come from. It can come from any part of the population. And so you get more resources of creative people that way. You get less liabilities in it. So it makes sense for the system. And it's fairer and so on. But we don't do that. I have to be objective. And the only way I can do that is have objective measurements. In that book, you see the measurements. So you can look at where we are in education relative to the rest of the world, where we are in infrastructure, and you could see that change. And you could see how the United States is in relationship. So you can see those things objectively. And yes, of course, it's common sense. If you educate your people and they are more civil with each other and you provide equal opportunity, the system will work better. The capitalist system is a remarkable, fabulous system. But when it produces the big inequalities of opportunity and productivity, yes, we could make good investments and infrastructure. When this went down and they have school, the kids didn't have computers and they didn't have connectivity. That's like not having electricity. How can we have that? So what we had to do, we do it philanthropically, but it's not enough. And so there's capitalism that can increase productivity. You can increase the size of the pie and you can distribute it well. There are things you can do. Success has to do, most importantly, with how you handle what you don't know rather than what you do know. And that how you get it from other people is the most important thing, right? And how you orchestrate those people. It's not like one guy sitting there knowing it all and dictating how it should go. But it's the opposite. Everybody makes mistakes and everybody's got a lot of weaknesses. And knowing how to deal with that well, you learn more from mistakes, right? Because it produces pain and pain says don't do that again or figure out another way of doing it. And then mistakes, it's part of the process of learning. And we have weaknesses. You can't think all different which ways and you can't have enough info. That's just a reality. But that's right. I think a lot of people think that the people who've been successful are different than they really are. So I started my company in 1975, and in 1980, 81, I just had a few people working for me, and I had calculated that American banks had lent more money to foreign countries than those countries were going to be able to pay back, and that they were going to default, and that was going to create a big debt crisis that would create a big economic crisis. And I got a lot of attention for that because it was very and a number of countries defaulted on their debts. And I thought we were going to have this big economic crisis. And I couldn't have been more wrong. That was the exact bottom in the stock market. I lost clients. I lost money myself. I was so broke that I had to borrow $4,000 from my dad to take care of family bills. Very, very painful. And yet it changed my way of thinking. It was one of the best things that ever happened to me. First of all, it gave me the humility or fear of being wrong, but without me losing my audacity. In other words, I wanted to have the great upside, but upside goes with risk. So it forced me to sort of think about how I should be, which taught me a few things. First, it taught me to find the smartest people I could find who disagree with me, to stress test my thinking and hear their points of view. It taught me a radical open-mindedness. It taught me that if I can diversify well, I could reduce my risks without reducing my returns. And it gave me an approach to life. Like I was in a position in which, okay, there's risk and returns. And it felt like I'm one side of a jungle. And that if I can cross this jungle, which is very dangerous, I could get to the other side and have a wonderful life. Or should I stay on the safe side of the jungle and not do that? And, of course, I had to cross the jungle, but how would I do that? And the way that I did it, I learned, was to find people who were on the same mission, who could see things that I couldn't see, and we could see together. And I loved going across through that jungle so much, essentially, that I don't want to leave the jungle. I just want to be in it with them doing this. That experience changed my life. I'm a global macro investor betting how the world's going to go. The upsides were a lot bigger than the downsides. And we've been doing that, for 47 years. And it was that painful experience. I learned a principle that is in my mind and has become a habit. Pain plus reflection equals progress. Because what it is a lot is habit, and you get your habit from cues. And so what seems to me now is if I have a painful experience, I view it as a puzzle, that if I solve the puzzle, which is, how does reality work and how would I deal with it better in the future, I will get a gem. And that gem is some principle, which I will literally write down and say, okay, now I'm going to do that thing in the future. So my habit has become different. Also, I accept my realities. Life gives you your reality. Some of them you don't like. It's just reality and you have to deal with your realities. That's the game. And so, that was my experience.